that introduction and to the organizers. And so what I'm going to talk about today is, ironically enough for Edmonton, we're going to talk about heat stress. And I'm sure it does get hot here in the summer, but I usually come here in the winter time for some reason. As we all know, we've all been hot, we've all been cold. Working with athletes, we know they suffer in the heat generally, and that they don't exercise or ride or run as hard as they can when they are hot. So that's going to be the first part of my talk. I'm going to talk about the generalities of heat and performance and some of the physiologies behind why we cannot exercise as hard, and also what it may mean for whether you're race organizers, whether you're a coach or first aid providers. Second part, we're going to talk about the actual process of heat adaptation. We're going to go do a bit of a dive into a recent meta-analysis that I participated in, looking at all of the literature on heat adaptation with sports performance. And in the third leg of our triathlon today, we're going to talk about some other considerations. It's going to be a grab bag of other ideas on the effects of fitness, on the effects of motivational training, on the challenges with implementing the actual process of heat adaptation. So that's how this talk is going to be structured. So we'll start off by hopefully proving to you that heat does impair performance and looking at the data behind that. This is a really nice study done by Eli in 2007. And what he did was did a retrospective analysis of a wide range of marathons around the world and different conditions, different times of the year through many, many years. And what he looked at was he looked at the effects of environmental temperature using the classic WBGT, which stands for wet bulb globe temperature. It's a standardized way of quantifying heat stress. And he looked at, again, about 30, 40 different marathons, and he compared the finishing times of the fastest finishers up through about the 300th place of these big marathons. So we're talking about still pretty fast marathoners, because we're going from the winners up to even the slowest people in this analysis is at 3-hour mark. So it's still a pretty fast group. So the interesting thing was he categorized and broke down the heat stress and the ambient temperature, again using WBGT, into 4 different graphs. So here was a relatively cool environmental temperature, 10 degrees. Then there was 15, 20, and 25. And there's some, if you look at this, there's some really interesting ideas that pop out. The first is that, we think of, here we are in a room temperature about 20 to 23 degrees Celsius, and we think that's a comfortable temperature. But already in this kind of environment, there is significant heat stress, significant impairment in performance capacity compared to, say, the 10 degrees or even the 15 degrees. The other thing is that the impairment occurs at all levels. It's a little bit less, quite a bit less in the fastest finishers, because they're just out there for less time. They're out there for just 2 hours rather than 3 hours. So there's a lot less variability in their performance. And we'll come back to this idea of fitness and how it impacts performance. The other thing, obviously, the reverse of that is that the relative effect is worse the slower you are. So this really plays out in course design and as a course organizer. It's not necessarily the fastest guys you have to worry about. It's the age groupers, it's the slower marathoners, slower triathletes who may be finishing a race not in the fastest time, but again, in a marathon, instead of 3 hours, you can imagine what the 4-hour people might be like, or the 4.5 hours. Those are the people out there the longest. They may be the ones most at risk. They did the exact same analysis doing it for females and showed that there was no difference. So the same pattern of impairment occurs for females. To summarize this part of it is, as organizers, as coaches, you really have to be looking at what your athlete or who your athlete is and who you are catering for. Again, as course organizers, I can't emphasize enough, The fastest guys and girls, they will generally be okay, with obviously exceptions, but it's really the later, slower people that you have to be concerned about. Because over the course of a day, you may be starting a marathon at 7 in the morning, maybe relatively cool then, but by the time the slower finishers come in, they may be at noon, they may be at 1 in the afternoon for a half Ironman, for example. So you have greater solar radiation. Instead of being 7 in the morning, just around sunrise, you're now in the heat of the day. You have higher ambient temperature. You can also have higher relative humidities during those times. This was really brought home in Chicago 2007 during the marathon, where at the start, it was 22 degree wet bulb globe temperature at the start, but 3.5 hours later, again, the fastest guys, even those guys in the previous examples, they've finished by now. But 3.5 hours later, the slower people were still out there. The wet bulb globe temperature was in a really, really uncomfortable situation at 28.9 degrees. That's when they called the marathon off, you may recall that. And during that race, there was 66 hospital admissions, intensive care cases, and 1 death as a result. So again, be careful about that. Why do we fatigue in the heat? I'm not going to go into all of the different mechanisms, but starting in about the mid-90s, the last 2 decades, scientists realized that hot temperatures in and of itself really have a lot of physiological impact on performance and our ability to exercise. So this was a summary that I wrote with Gord Sleevert in 2004, and this is looking at a lot of different ideas, from brain temperature increasing and not being able to recruit our muscles as well, to ideas of the gut being damaged and being leaky, and therefore a lot of the toxins normally in our gastrointestinal system is now leaking out into the blood, causing inflammation, causing sepsis. So we just tried to summarize a whole bunch of different ideas. Most of them are still quite valid now, and work is still continuing on these. And I can certainly, again, my email is available. I can certainly send this graphic to everyone if needed. So again, as first aid course organizers, what is the really important thing to do if you find someone who has heat stroke? The really critical factor is to cool them down as rapidly as possible. This was a study done on rats looking at survival times after passive heating. And what they found was it was really a combination of the magnitude of hyperthermia and also the duration. So the hotter you become, kind of at a critical temperature, and also the longer you stay at that temperature, the more dangerous it is. So the priority really is get them cooled down as soon as possible. The best way to do it is to have an ice bath, have cold baths that you can put the entire person in, obviously up to the chest or the neck. And you need to be monitoring them so they don't fall unconscious or slip underwater. But water is infinitely preferred compared to air or compared to having a fan, because it has much higher thermal conductivity. You can cool them down much, much faster. It's why 15-degree air, you can still be wearing a t-shirt quite comfortably. 15-degree water, you're going to be shivering pretty quickly. The absolute water temperature is still in somewhat debate, but really the key is ideally to have an ice bath, get them as cold as possible or cool as possible as quickly as possible. You want them to be at least in the water at 24, 26 degrees, if not lower. Okay, so that brings us to the first leg of the triathlon. Fittingly enough, we're just talking about water. So in the transition, what have we summarized so far? Hopefully I've convinced you that there is clear hot weather impairments, and that the lower your fitness, the greater the impairment. And again, we'll come back to this idea later. And in terms of the take-home messages of males versus females, it seems you're equally impaired. There's no real systematic difference in terms of the level of impairment from heat stress. In terms of triathlons, how this applies is the challenge really becomes in the run. During the bike, most individuals are still riding pretty fast, 30 kilometers an hour or more, and there's a lot of airflow, a lot of air kind of cooling over the body. Whereas in running, again, if we're thinking about the slower individuals, they may be only going about 10 kilometers an hour on hot asphalt. There's not that much cooling. It's also later in the day. So it's really the run that's the big challenge. And as I demonstrated with that slide, hyperthermia is very complex. There's multiple factors, and the ideal recovery is water immersion. So let's transition to the second part is, if we know that heat is bad, what can we do about it? And the biggest thing we can do is to adapt ourselves to heat gradually. It's obviously a challenge for a lot of northern countries. For example, going to Kona for the Ironman, and in late October, where it may already be quite cool in our home countries. But this was a slide put out by the Singapore Defense Agency, looking at some of the other things that we can be doing. We won't talk about them here. We will talk a little bit more about aerobic fitness training, but obviously we can, in a soldier's case, we can cool them before exercise. We can do that with team sports also. And this kind of plays into water temperature and whether, in a sense, you go with a wetsuit or not, if you're right on the fine bubble of being allowed. And obviously, you can't do this in a race situation of resting, but the other thing is fluid ingestion. So there's a whole host of strategies. We're mainly going to focus on the process of heat adaptation. Again, just another scary slide to put up. When we're talking about adapting to heat, it's not just a matter when we say, yeah, we want to go for 2 weeks in the heat or whatever. It's not a simple matter of just changing simple things, as we'll talk about with core temperature, with heart rate. There's a whole host of physiology involved. Your entire cardiovascular system changes, your fluid balance changes. So there's a whole host of interrelated conditions, each with their own kind of timelines, and we'll talk about how long it takes to adapt in the different systems. So again, this is just to show that there's a really complex mechanisms at play here. Okay, so as I mentioned, in 2016, we published in Sports Medicine a meta-analysis. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, a meta-analysis is essentially a systematic review of the literature where we kind of quantify and statistically analyze the results of numerous studies to come up with a conclusion. So that's in general what a meta-analysis is. What we specifically want to look at was heat adaptation on exercise performance. So we want to look at the magnitude of changes in different physiological markers, and also more importantly, the performance measures. So all of the papers we looked at had a detailed performance focus. The other critical thing we want to look at is we want to look at this idea of dose response and how much heat adaptation do we need to really have a significant benefit. Is there a threshold, kind of a ceiling effect? How quickly can we adapt individuals, or do we really need, say, 2 weeks or more? We also want to look at some of the mediating factors such as age, sex, and also fitness. So how we did it, we looked at a variety of adaptation types. We looked at, and we can go into this in a little bit more detail in the discussion, but we were really trying to separate the different ways to adapt. Some are where you control the core temperature, and you try to maintain your core temperature at a set level for a period of time, and that's the isothermal method. Most of it is a controlled. You just go out and, for example, tell your athletes to do this set workout, and everybody does the same workout over that period of time. The duration, we split up the different studies, and there was a lot of studies that we started with, and we broke them down into short-term heat adaptation, so STHA, which we categorize as less than 7 days. Then the majority of the studies we found was in this medium-term heat adaptation, so about 1 to 2 weeks in that time frame. Again, that's where most of the studies we found were doing heat adaptation. Then we had long-term heat adaptation, which was over 14 days. There really weren't that many studies that actually studied this. And you can imagine the logistics of trying to run a study like this. In summary, out of all of the papers that we did, we ended up categorizing and analyzing about 92 different papers. In all of those studies, they had 976 participants. Only 8% are female. So this is a real huge research gap in terms of the possibly different responses across the sexes in terms of heat adaptation. And I'm actually talking to a postdoc about possibly joining my lab to look at this specific topic. Just to familiarize you with some of the terms I'll be talking about, the way in meta-analysis you kind of analyze the statistical significance is you look at their effect size. So depending on kind of the magnitude of change, you can say it's anything from a trivial response through to a small, moderate, and a large response. So I'm going to be using those terms throughout, so I just want to get you familiar with them. But they're a statistical tool to see how big the effect actually is in a practical sense. Obviously, the big limitations of a heat adaptation study is that you can't really blind the participants to it. They know if they're in the heat or if they're in a cooler environments. Most of the studies have one significant weakness, which is that they don't have a control group, a group that does the exact same training, but in a cooler environment. So most of them just looked at before and after, but didn't have another group. So one of the weakness may be that it's just the actual training that has improved them, not necessarily the heat part of the manipulation. I'll start off with the biggest question you may all have is, does performance affect, does it improve? And Gregoire just showed one forest plot, but this is, again, the typical way a meta-analysis is presented, is looking at kind of the bulk effects. So what we have is we analyzed out of those 92, we had 48 data sets of actual performance measures of, say, time trials or time to exhaustion type test. So what we have here is this is no effect, this vertical bar, and I'm showing you this because most of the slides will be using this exact presentation. What we have is short-term, medium-term, long-term example. But in all of these situations, the performance significantly improved. There was a huge difference, or what we would say, there was a large difference in performance improvement in all of these different manipulations. Out of the 48 data sets, 43% of them, or 43 of them, had at least a 1% improvement in the performance measure. The mean was a 16% improvement with a median of 8%. What we found in terms of the dose response is that a short-term heat adaptation was able to improve the performance, and there was some benefit, but the longer you can do it, the better. So while short-term and medium-term was an improvement, the longer you can do it, it seems to be the better the improvements. And in terms of the different types of heat adaptation, again, that isothermal, where you're trying to maintain a set core temperature for the entire time, versus a controlled where you just tell them to do a particular workout, they both had a moderate benefit. The self-paced one seemed to have the largest benefit, where in a self-paced protocol is one where you tell them to keep a certain heart rate, because as you become fitter, your heart rate, and more heat adapted, your heart rates can become lower, so you're going to naturally increase the intensity throughout. All of these studies, by the way, the heat adaptation studies, were done with exercise in the heat. There's been no real studies looking at passive heat adaptation. So for example, sitting in a warm bath or in a sauna repeatedly. We found no significant effect of temperature, age, or fitness. So that's the performance. Good news, it can be improved. The core and skin temperature showed a similar idea in terms of there was a moderate to large benefit in terms of decreasing your initial core temperature. That's one of the classical kind of symptoms of being heat adapted. Your resting core temperature is lower. The duration effect, again, the longer, this is a standard message I'm going to be giving, the longer you can adapt to heat, the better, but still short and medium term does have benefit in terms of lowering your core temperature. Again, we found no significant effect of age, fitness, or sex. We also found a decrease in skin temperature during exercise overall after heat adaptation. Okay, looking at heart rate, another classical measure is that your heart rate, both at rest and at exercise, is going to decrease with heat adaptation, and we certainly found that. We found that there was a moderate decrease in the resting heart rate, and also a large decrease in the heart rate during exercise at the same kind of work level. So that's also good news. There's less cardiovascular strain. This is another example where the longer you can adapt them, the better, but still short and medium term heat adaptation is beneficial. There was negligible effect on things like the blood pressure, stroke volume, cardiac output. So it mainly seems to be a decrease in heart rate, and most of that seems to be fueled by an increase in your plasma volume, in the amount of blood that you have. So the other key measure that we often look at is sweating and your overall fluid balance. We found that the total sweat rate increased significantly, and most of you have seen that either in yourself or in your athletes, that over the course of a summer of racing and training, they sweat a lot more. And that is obviously beneficial if they can evaporate that heat or evaporate that sweat from their body. It becomes less of a benefit if they're not able to evaporate it and if it is just dripping off of them, in which case they're just getting dehydrated faster. The sweat rate definitely does increase. It increases in a number of ways physiologically. The core temperature at which you start sweating becomes lower, so it becomes more responsive or responds quicker. And then also the sensitivity. You can look at that as the gain. The hotter you become, the more you will sweat once you are heat adapted. So for every 1 degree core temperature, your sweating rate increases more when you are heat adapted. There's a decrease in your electrolyte levels, so your total electrolyte loss may not be more, even though you are sweating more. Your sweat glands train themselves to retain more of the sodium before the fluid is excreted. This is yet another case where there is short-term benefit, but the longer you can adapt them, the greater that sweating response will be. This leads back to the previous one, looking at heart rate. The biggest change seems to be a systematic increase in your plasma volume in terms of your fluid balance. The other interesting thing is there's been relatively limited studies, and that's what that double across means. There's very few studies looking at your actual thirst sensation, but the ones that do have that data suggest that there's a decrease in thirst during exercise after you're heat adapted, and therefore there may be less voluntary fluid consumption. So this may be a concern if the athlete is adapted, but yet they're sweating more, but they don't feel that thirsty and they may not be drinking as much. So this is a case where you may have to consider really enforcing a drinking schedule, especially throughout a longer triathlon. This is a really interesting thing, and this goes back to what Alex Hutchinson was talking about yesterday, and also Ross Tucker, looking at the weight of evidence versus single studies. This was a classic study done by the US military in 1977, and they were looking at, can fitter individuals adapt to heat faster? And they certainly came up with the conclusion that yes, the fitter you are, the faster you adapt. And what they have here was they developed a regression equation that based on your core temperature, how rapidly it plateaus over repeated days of adaptation. And so their conclusion was that yes, there definitely was a benefit to being fitter. They also found that there was a slower decay once you become heat adapted. It took longer for those changes to atrophy and go away. And also they were able to readapt faster. So that's all great news. The challenge, though, is when we did the meta-analysis and we looked at this, we found there was no significant effect on anything in terms of fitness. We saw that with heart rate, core temperature, and also with actual performance. So, the jury is still out on whether the fitter you are, the quicker you adapt. Okay, so now we've come to the end of the heat adaptation part. Let's look at what we have learned so far. We've learned that adaptation is possible, and it will improve your physiology and also, more importantly, your performance. We also found that there was a dose-response effect. The good news is even if you only have a few days to adapt to heat, you can get some benefits. You won't get as much as if you were fully adapted over the course of 2 weeks or possibly more. And one of the key measures is going to be sweat rate. Sweat tends to be the slowest responder. That's going to take the longest time. Again, it's somewhat equivocal, the effect of fitness. All right, so we've finished the second leg. Let's look at some of the other considerations we may need to have when we're talking about heat stress and heat adaptation. So again, this goes back to the whole idea of fitness, and fitness is really interesting, and the whole question of why can fitter individuals perform better, and especially perform better in the heat. One of the interesting ideas is that the fitter individuals can simply kind of tone down their perception of discomfort, especially in a hot and uncomfortable setting. One of the best studies kind of supporting this idea was done by the Canadian military up in my PhD lab in Downsview in Toronto. And what Peter Tequisas did was he looked at a group of untrained individuals versus a group of aerobically trained individuals. So huge difference in their VO2 max. They had them exercises with chemical warfare clothing in 40 degrees Celsius, relatively low humidity. And what he looked at was he quantified two things. He looked at a physiological strain index, which is really a weighted average of your heart rate and core temperature. And then he also modeled a perceptual strain index. And what that is, that involves a weighting of your ratings of perceived exertion and also your thermal comfort or your thermal discomfort. So there's like a metabolic aspect and a thermal aspect of both of those measures. So we again looked at those two fitness groups. This is the unfit group. And what we had was a really nice matching of the physiological strain in the solid line and the perceptual strain in the dashed line. So they got hot, they got bothered, and their physiology matched their perception. But what happened with the fit group? With the fit group, we had the exact same kind of physiological strain in terms of pattern, same strain as the unfit group. They ended up just as physiologically stressed, but look at their perception. They were able to essentially feel less discomfort, both from an exercise perspective and also a thermal perspective at a very hot environment. Okay, so this really brings to the idea of the habituation and the experience, and so maybe that's where really the physiology and the fitness comes in. It may not necessarily be something physiological, maybe more the perception and the habituation being uncomfortable in a hot environment. This has led to, studies like this have led to a lot of research looking at, well, again, what is it in the brain that causes us to control our exercise? And can we, in essence, manipulate it? This was a study we did in our lab with Phil Wallace, my master's student. What we did was we had individuals, trained cyclists in the lab, and they did 30 minutes of riding in the heat. Then they did a tolerance test where they were riding at a very high intensity, 80% of their peak power output for as long as they can. We also did cognitive testing in the heat. And then we had two groups. We had a classical control group that just went home, did the regular training. We had another group that was trained in a sports psychology skill called motivational skills training. It was specifically geared towards exercise and tolerance to being uncomfortable in the heat, to really reframe negative thoughts such as, oh, this is so hot, I'm sweating buckets, it's so uncomfortable, to being reframing those into positive mantras and positive kind of words instead. This was the main data graph that we had from there. On the top is the untrained or the control group that had no training. These are individual values and mean values. Their time to exhaustion in the heat had no change. If anything, actually it dropped a bit by about 4%. But in the fit group, you see the trend here. Almost all of the individuals improved their actual tolerance time, and the mean value also significantly increased by 26%. The really interesting thing was that motivational skills training group also had improvement in their cognitive function in the heat. and they were essentially able to have this increase in executive function, or kind of your decision-making part of your kind of cognitive processes. So it seems that this motivational skills training, even in really fit individuals, can improve your performance even without any physiological change. So that seems quite interesting, and it really goes back to the idea of experience habituation. So the heat adaptation time course, this was, one of the ideas really is how quickly can you adapt? Well, what this Danish and Qatari group did was they took trained Danish cyclists and had them do a 43-kilometer outdoor time trial in Denmark in quite cool conditions, 5 degrees Celsius. That was their average wattage over that time, so very strong cyclists. They then took them to Qatar for 2 weeks, obviously much hotter environment. And then they tested them, again, obviously a different course out on the road, but still the same length. And they looked at immediately afterwards, day 1, after about a week, and after 2 weeks. What did they find? They found here's this y-axis, that's 100%. That represents your time trial performance in the cold or the cooler environment back home. So that's kind of your base reference. So in day 1, you saw a huge decrease in performance down to about 85% of your normal baseline performance. After a week of living in the desert, you improved by about 14%. You got up to about 92% of your baseline performance in the cool weather. And then you also had a little bit of a further improvement with 2 weeks of adaptation. So that really matches well with what we've been talking about in the second part of the talk. But the key thing is you still never return back to baseline. So there still remains impairment in the heat even after you are adapted. You will still never get to be as good as you were back in a cooler environment. So whether you're trying to really have a peak performance or set a PB, these are really important things to consider. Now, the really interesting thing is, Gregoire just talked about altitude training, how it affects and can improve your performance when you come back to sea level. The question is, well, can we do something similar with heat adaptation? If we become heat adapted, can we improve our performance in a normal, cooler environment? We saw that there's lower heart rates, there's lower core temperature, there's greater sweating, there's less perceptual discomfort, all of these great things. The same group then took those athletes back to Denmark and had them do the exact time trial again. Slightly warmer environment, 13 degrees Celsius instead of 5. The important thing to note was they had a pure control group. They had another group of just as fit individuals who stayed in Denmark instead of going to Qatar. And this was the main thing, VO2 max, no difference in the control or the heat adapted group when they came back to Denmark. And this was tested right after they came back. The other benefit was between Denmark and Qatar, there wasn't really a huge number of time zone changes, so we didn't have a huge kind of jet lag problem. Now this is the really interesting thing. The control group, no difference in their time trial performance, and also in their wattage. In the heat adapted group, they came back, they were heat adapted, we had all these great changes, but no difference in performance, no difference in the absolute, kind of the average power. So what this really suggests is that heat adaptation is specific to heat performance. So it can't really be used as an ergogenic aid for cooler weather. Now the final thing there's 2 more points I want to talk about. One is, does hot equals hot equals hot? Okay, if we know heat adaptation is good, but if we're going to, again, Qatar, where it's hot and dry, can we adapt in a hot and humid environment and get the same benefits, or does it need to be the same? There's only one study that's ever been done on this in 1997. I'll just go through it quickly, but essentially they had 4 different heat adaptations. They had nothing, they had a control group, they had a hot and dry, a warm and humid, and a normal temperature, but with a lot of radiative heat load, so basically big heat lamps. They looked at the Timecourse, and then the really neat thing is that they swapped them around afterwards. They also tested them in a warm, humid, and in a hot, dry environment. The end summary, I won't go through the graph in the interest of time, But the time course of heat adaptation across all of those environments were similar, whether it was radiant adaptation, hot and dry, or warm and humid. The other thing is when they swapped them around to different environments, even if you were adapted to a hot and dry environment, you were equally performing just as well as the warm and humid group when you were tested in warm and humid. So it seems that the main purpose is just to get your core temperature up and get your body to start responding. It doesn't matter whether it's with hot and dry, warm and humid. So this may suggest that just wearing a lot of clothing, even if you have nothing else, wear a lot of clothing. Don't turn on the fan if you are training indoors, for example, to build up that heat. The final thing I want to talk about is this idea of dehydration stimulus. If we know that heat adaptation, one of the big things is you tend to dehydrate, and we always tell athletes we need to drink. Some studies have come out suggesting that you can really accelerate your heat adaptation by dehydrating at the same time as you're exercising in the heat. You still want to drink afterwards and recover that way, but during the actual exercise, the combination of dehydration and exercise in the heat can accelerate that process of heat adaptation. And this is the main graph looking at that. Okay, so there seems to be some synergy. There's only been about 3 or 4 studies out, but this may be a way, again, to accelerate that process of heat adaptation. Okay, so we've heading to the finish line. Hopefully, what I've shown in this third section is that there is a fitness benefit. It may not be pure physiology, but it certainly seems to be perception and experience and adaptation to discomfort in the heat. The other important thing is that there doesn't seem to be a specificity. So again, Gregoire talked about the difference between hypobaric and a normal baric hypoxia. That doesn't seem to be the case with heat adaptation. The main thing seems to be get the individuals warmer and do that for as long as you can before the competition. And then the last thing is just a suggestion. That's why there's a question mark there. It's a dehydration during the process of heat adaptation may also be a benefit. All right, so with that, I want to say thank you, and I've crossed the finish line, and I do have, as mentioned, just published a Cycling Science this July, and I do have copies here if anyone wants to see them. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Dr. Cheung, for a very nice talk. If anyone has any questions, then at this time, why don't we take a few minutes and these gentlemen can field your questions.
This question is for Dr. Cheung. I just was wondering, with a lot of athletes traveling to races, some people have, certain lives and timelines, basically. So they can either go, the day before the race, 2 days before, 3, 4, 5 days. Is there an ideal time? Obviously, longer is better. I had heard kind of some of the opposites as well, that living in a higher altitude a higher temperature can sort of fatigue the body going into an event as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. You're going to have some impairment, as I showed, in terms of your absolute performance in the heat. So I think it's really tricky balancing that, and I can talk to you certainly more in detail about the whole process of kind of tapering and how to fit that. I'll just go through the process I went through with Amber Neben, the U.S. cyclist who I helped develop an adaptation protocol for before the Qatar World Championships in 2016, and I was very happy she actually won. But she was in LA, so it was still warm-ish, but not crazy hot. And so one of the things we did was, for example, kind of mix it up before her travel in terms of her hard effort days. We had her still do them in relatively, obviously without much clothing, with her normal clothing on, but she still needed that longer endurance ride afterwards. So what we had her do was, after those hard intervals were done in her optimal capacity, we then had her bundle up with a lot of clothing and continue riding for 90 minutes or 2 hours or whatever to still continue to keep that thermal stimulus going. So that's one possibility, that you can kind of almost double dip a workout. And so there's a few creative ways that you can do it, and I can certainly talk to you a lot more about that in the break.
Thank you both for your talks. They're awesome. Dr. Cheung, I think I might have an idea of that my question will be based more around there needing more research, but we have a lot of experience taking athletes to the Badwater Ultra Marathon in Death Valley. So it's 135 miles at about 50 degrees Celsius. We've been practicing doing training methods for up to 6 weeks of heat training. Mm-hmm. And we found sort of the same thing as you, that after about 2 weeks, we see the decrease of homeostatic set point and increase in sweating. But after that, in towards 6 weeks, we actually see their set point increase. They burn hot and they sweat less. And to just be comfortable in a room or a training environment, they actually have to like bundle up to stay warm. Does this jive with you, or?
Yeah, that's really fascinating data. It's as I mentioned, the logistics of doing a lab-based study of over 2 weeks is enormous, and it's something for my students when they approach me with those ideas, it says, well, let's think of something simpler first. But so the data really hasn't been done in terms of a long heat adaptation. As I mentioned, it was only about 5 or 6 studies that have gone over 2 weeks. So I'd be really interested in talking to you more about, is it the case that, there's that initial improvement, and then afterwards you just, in essence, you just almost atrophy and detrain in terms of your adaptation. Yeah. So I'd love to talk with you more. The answer is we don't know, because the research hasn't been done.
Cool.
Either in a lab or really, I think, a field setting.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll chat later.
Thanks, guys. Those are 2 really excellent reviews. Gregoire, the big question I have is, you talk mostly about using altitude to prepare people for racing at sea level. Go back to 1968, and there still are a few high-level championships performed at high altitude. What do you do different if you have to race at high altitude?
So there are some recommendations that you have to acclimatize at the altitude of the competition. Chapman again published a study about the best time of arrival. So it just showed that ideally if you can arrive, let's say 10 days before, that's better than to arrive at the last minute. But if you have no option, it's better to arrive really few hours before the competition instead of the previous night. So it seems that there is a window where being at altitude without the acclimatization can be more detrimental than just arriving at the last minute. But in both cases, it would be worse performance than if you are fully acclimatized. And it will take, I would recommend at least 2 weeks if you can. But as we know, in professional sport, it's very difficult to get the people going for competition and staying too long before the on-site. So it's a type of balance. I did advise many athletes, for example, doing the Hard Rock. It's a trail mountain race in the States, so it's quite high. And even if the competition by itself can be above 4,000 meters, we don't recommend them to sleep too high, because then the detrimental effect of the poor sleep quality will be worse than the potentially higher acclimatization, ventilatory acclimatization. I didn't have time to develop about leave high, train high, leave high, train low, but now it seems there is a consensus that the top altitude is about 3,000 meters. It might be a bit higher with people who have like genetic characteristics to be from altitude population, or people who are really experimented. But 3,000 meters in hypobaric hypoxia, now we adapt when it is in normobaric hypoxia, because we know that the severity of the stress is less. So for 3,000 meters in hypobaric hypoxia, we can go up to 3,002, 3,003 in normobaric hypoxia.
Wondering if you had any advice or points on monitoring about when athletes are training at altitude and then they come back down to perform at sea level to race and compete. Just in my experience, it seems that some people can drop in and they're fine after 3 days. Other people, it's 7 days. Other athletes think they feel great, and then 10 minutes into the race, they realise they feel terrible. So is there anything that we can do to monitor that response?
Yeah, obviously there are different windows. As you mentioned, there's potentially a first window that could be beneficial, but it's very variable between the athletes. So some guys can break their record only 2 days after going down from high training camps. But the most secure period is plateau after 2 weeks, 17 days, 21 days. So, and to my knowledge, there is no ideal way to monitor this fluctuation in fitness capacity, let's say, of post-altitude. The best way is to check the feeling of the athletes using like questionnaire and to monitor their response in training. And then it makes also evident that there is absolutely no reason to use altitude training prior to a massive international competition without having used before the year before, or because we have people, they will never adapt, they will never respond positively to altitude training, so you have to stop that for them. We don't, it's not perfectly, the way to identify responders and non-responders, it's not completely accurate for elite athletes, elite endurance athletes. So my suggestion to you is just monitor their fitness, use questionnaire about their feeling, because the athletes will know better than you if they feel good or bad. And I would be surprised that you have too many athletes who would be very successful after 7 days, because it's a period that is a negative period usually, 7 days. It might happen, but it would be an exception.
Gregoire, Stephen, thank you very much for those wonderful talks. I'm just wondering about fuel and nutrition, and in your work, has there been a layer of research that looked at the impact of nutrition or fuel sources, energy sources, on the impact of altitude training?
So the key point is hydration, and especially during the acclimatization period. And we know also that at altitude you will use more carbohydrates for the same intensity, so you will have a shift in your glucid lipid breakpoint, you know. So it can induce that you will have more risk also of hypoglycemia. Like top cyclists, for example, they are so used to training that they won't have any hypoglycemia at sea level, and they might have again at altitude. So you have to adapt your support. You have to provide more carbohydrate in the breakfast, maybe to have more support during the training. But for me, very often the most dangerous and the most detrimental point is poor hydration, poor monitoring of hydration during the camp, but especially during the acclimatization phase. You know, very often when you take junior and senior at an altitude training camp, the junior, during the first week, they will fly. They are faster than the elite. They don't know that they have to stay at very moderate intensities. They don't rest, and then after they get sick or they blow. So it's very important to monitor training, intensity, hydration, and coming to your point about nutrition, more carbohydrate, no antioxidants. It's a very important point. And probably some type of supplementation to decrease the infection risk. There's nothing perfect for that.
And then in terms of heat adaptation, there really has been nothing done in terms of can you also manipulate fueling, and does that have any benefit or not? The only studies really are those ones looking at dehydration, and that seeming to accelerate the process. But in terms of, again, the mix of fuels and things, that's really an unexplored area.
It seems that it is beneficial for endurance performance, but even more at altitude to use beetroot juice, like nitrate, dietary nitrate, and then iron. Iron supplementation is key.
Thanks again to our two speakers, and nice discussion.